Okay, all right, everyone. Welcome again to our Asian American Literature and Culture session 2 at PAMLA. My name is Nancy Carranza. I am a 6th-year PhD student at University of California in Riverside, and I have had a lot of fun. It's been a privilege to be able to organize these 2 panels, and I'm really looking forward to all the presentations we have today. So first up, our first presenter is Dr. Evan Le Espiritu Gandhi. She is an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her interdisciplinary work engages critical refugee studies, settler colonial studies, and trans-Pacific studies. Her book, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine, is forthcoming with the University of California Press in spring 2022. And her presentation is called Historicizing the Trans-Pacific Settler Colonial Condition. So go ahead, Evan, go ahead and begin.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you, everyone. It's so great to see you. I just want to give a shout out to Lilith, who was in my PhD cohort. So it's so great to see you virtually. Thanks for coming. So my name is Evan Le Espiritu Gandhi. I'm zooming in from West LA. So I just want to situate myself on the traditional homelands of the Tombi Gabrielino peoples. As Nancy said, the title of my talk today is Historicizing the Trans-Pacific Settler Colonial Condition. So I'm just going to share a screen and see some slides. All right. So, oops. All right. So, no, let's go back. So this talk is based on a recently published article, actually, with a similar name, Historicizing the Trans-Pacific Settler Colonial Condition, Asian Indigenous Relations in Sean Wong's Home Base and Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer. So if you want to learn more after my brief comments today, I'll post a link in the chat for the article. But in this article, I theorize what I'm calling, my PowerPoint's having some difficulties, but what I'm calling the Trans-Pacific Settler Colonial Condition. So thinking about the interconnected nature of Indigenous struggles against settler colonialism across multiple geographies, so the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, given shared histories of American empire and US military violence. And in my comments today, I'm gonna elaborate on this analytic. So just a brief outline. I'll start by sharing some context as well as the main argument of the longer article. Then I'll share a brief example from the first novel, Sean Wong's Home Base, which was published in 1979. And then one example from Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer from 2015, which we talked a lot about in the first panel this morning. And lastly, I just want to end with some comments about how this Trans-Pacific Settler Colonial Condition also connects to my larger book project, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine, which I'm really excited is forthcoming with University of California Press in spring 2022. All right, so let's begin. So in recent years, as many of you probably have noticed, the field of Asian American studies has witnessed a proliferation, right, of scholarship on Asian settler colonialism, as well as Asian indigenous encounters, highlighting the ways in which Asian American struggles for civil rights and inclusion in the settler colonial state have unwittingly and usually unintentionally undermined ongoing and contemporaneous indigenous struggles for sovereignty. So this contemporary nature of this recent field seems to suggest that the Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition might be a relatively new concern for Asian American studies and Asian American politics. But in contrast, I want to think about a longer genealogy. So I posit that the Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition is actually imminent to the very emergence of Asian American as a political identity all the way back to the 1960s. So during the Asian American movement of the long 1960s, and a movement that's actually better known for its anti-Vietnam War activism, pan-ethnic yellow power politics, and the fight for ethnic studies via the Third World Liberation Strike. So since the 1960s, how we sort of narrate the Asian American movement and the emergence of Asian American as a political identity, I think has really actually made invisible these inherent Asian indigenous political connections that were being made in this moment. So Asian American political subjectivity, in other words, has always had to grapple, actually, with its situatedness within the settler colonial United States and the concomitant American politics of imperial expansion across the Pacific Ocean. So to render visible this longer genealogy of the Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition and its co-articulation with Asian American political subjectivity, I want to turn to two important works of Asian American historical fiction. So the first one, as I previewed, is Sean Wong's Home Base. So it's one of the first self-identified works of Asian American literature from this sort of cohort of writers. And then more recently, Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer, a contemporary best-selling novel that has been translated and published in 29 other countries besides the United States as of at least October 2019 when I originally wrote this. So the former, Home Base, depicts the importance of the unincorporated territory of Guam for the Chinese American main character and narrator, Rainsford Chan, so his political development. While the latter, The Sympathizer, follows the journeys of an unnamed Vietnamese communist turned anti-communist sleeper agent across the Pacific. So Home Base was actually written during the Asian American movement, but it was about an earlier decade of 1950s Chinese American exclusion. While on the other hand, The Sympathizer was actually written during the contemporary moment, but it's about and sort of around the same time as the Asian American movement. And it's inserting the overlooked figure of the Vietnamese international student turned refugee. So read together, Wong's Home Base and Nguyen's The Sympathizer render visible actually the foundational co-articulation of Asian American political subjectivity with what I'm calling the Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition ever since the Asian American movement of the 1960s, long 1960s. So in this analysis, Asian American historical fiction becomes actually a site of revisionist history. And I think that this makes visible the foundational entanglement of Asian American subjectivity that emerged during this Asian American movement with the Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition. So Home Base highlights the complicity of militarized Asian American homemaking practices with what settler colonial studies scholar Patrick Wolf terms the settler colonial elimination of the native. Sympathizer, meanwhile, offers the figure of the Trans-Pacific refugee as a model for radical unsettlement, right, to sort of unsettle this settler colonial condition. So despite significant differences in the level of form and content between the two novels, both of them call attention to the interconnected nature of Indigenous sovereignty struggles across multiple locales, so Turtle Island, Guam, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And they also grapple with the vexed positionality of Asian American subjects who at times uphold the Trans-Pacific settler colonialism and at other times resist it. So it's a sort of ambiguous, complex politics. And both novels portray a masculinist version of Asian American political resistance. So at the very end of the article, I sort of question, I think that there is a need for a feminist praxis of Trans-Pacific decolonization. Maybe that model is not here in this novels, but sort of prompt other readers to sort of think about what that model would look like. Okay, so in order to better illustrate then this Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition, I'd like to share a brief example from Sean Wong's Home Base. But before doing so, I just want to tell a little bit more historical context. So as many of us know, American westward expansion across Indigenous lands in the North American continent, fueled by manifest destiny rhetoric, did not stop right with the West Coast or with California, but actually extended across the Pacific Ocean with, for example, the legal annexation of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the annexation of Guam and the Philippines in 1898 following the Spanish-American War. So Guam, or Guahan, remained a naval colony until 1950, when a Congressional Organic Act proclaimed Guam an unincorporated territory. So this granted the Indigenous Chamorro people American citizenship, but it denied them other constitutional rights, such as the right to vote for US president. So as the United States' westmost territory, Guam has been very heavily militarized. So it served as the, quote, tip of the sphere of American intervention into Asia. So during the Vietnam War, for example, Andersen Air Force Base, as well as Naval Base Guam, played key roles in helping to facilitate US military intervention into Southeast Asia. And today, the US military continues to control almost 1/3 of the island's surface area, manifesting in Catherine Lutz's words, quote, the highest ratio of US military spending and military hardware and land takings from indigenous US populations of any place on earth, end quote. All right, so let's go back to the novel. So in the novel, Chinese American first-person narrator Rainsford spends 1 year of his childhood and a very formative year in terms of the narrative on Guam. And throughout his life more broadly, he really grapples with his place in US society, given multiple generations of his family's experiences with Asian immigration restrictions. So early on in the novel, Rainsford narrates, quote, in 1956, my father taught me to sing Home on the Range on that island in the Pacific Ocean, referring to Wong. Standing there in the heat of an ocean lagoon, I sang out for my father about our home on the range and my friends, the buffalo and the antelope, end quote. So because of this long history of Chinese exclusion, it's really only outside of the continental American West or outside the quote unquote range, right? In this liminal unincorporated territory of Guam, that perhaps the Chinese American father, as well as the son, Rainsford, can proudly claim to be indeed home on the range. So such a claim of homemaking, however, I think really produces an ambiguous politics, a really complex politics. So on one hand, claiming home on the range in Guam highlights rather than obfuscates America's racist policies of Chinese exclusion and emphasizing the fact that Chinese Americans such as Rainsford and his father must turn to an unincorporated territory such as Guam, so sort of outside in this liminal space to feel finally at home or a sense of home. But on the other hand, such a declaration also reproduces an American territorial claim, right, over the island of Guam, which we have to know has ongoing indigenous sovereignty movements and decolonization movements. So by claiming Guam as a home for Chinese Americans, Rainsford and his father attempt to forcibly incorporate Guam into an American narrative, right, of manifest destiny and settler colonialism without any consultation with the indigenous Chamorro population, which are never really explicitly discussed or mentioned in the novel. So their Asian American homemaking practices, therefore, take on the valence of what Candace Fujikani and Jonathan Okamura have termed Asian settler colonialism. And to sort of unpack this a little bit more, we can look at the song Home on the Range, originally published in 1872, which has very settler colonial origins. And just as a sort of brief example of that, I'd like to turn to this stanza, which reads, the red man was pressed from this part of the West. He's likely no more to return. To the banks of the Red River, where seldom, if ever, their flickering campfires burn. So we can see a very genocidal logic at play here. So what does it mean that the main character of this novel, right, Rainsford Chan, as a sort of Asian American homemaking practice actually identifies with this song, right, Home of the Range? What other sort of genealogies is he therefore incorporating? So by locating home on the range in Guam, the novel is actually, I think, shouldn't be conflated, I think, with Rainsford Chan's, the character's perspective, right? So the novel itself draws attention, really, to this trans-Pacific settler colonial condition. So the extension of US militarism and manifest destiny narratives across the Pacific into these island territories. And this condition highlights the ways in which Native American genocide and displacement on Turtle Island, or what's now called the continental US, was and continues to be reproduced in the Pacific, for example, against Chamorros on Guahan. So next, I'd like to share an example from Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer. So in the novel, following the fall of Saigon in 1975, the eponymous first-person narrator in Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer is processed in a refugee camp on Guam, which we just discussed, before resettling in Southern California. So there, he's invited by a famous Hollywood director, modeled after Francis Ford Coppola, but he's identified only as the auteur in the novel, to attest to the ethnic authenticity of the film he's making, The Hamlet. And this scene was also discussed earlier this morning. So in this Vietnam War film, which is really the author Wing's stand-in, right, for Apocalypse Now. So in the film, a blonde green beret is tasked with saving the, quote, pre-lapsarian montagnards of a bucolic hamlet from a, quote unquote, King Kong, who's known as the baddest of the bad Viet Cong. And this is from page 125 of the novel. So expecting the narrator, right, to demurely rubber stamp this screenplay, the auteur is surprised when actually instead our narrator boldly critiques the film's representation of its Southeast Asian characters. And one such critique connects the plight of Indigenous Highlander minorities in Vietnam, identified in the script by this French catch-all term, montagnards, to that of Native Americans actually on Turtle Island, also known as the United States. So here's the quote. The narrator says, "What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or the Apache or the Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know when you say these people are montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru or the Nung or the Thai." So rather than rely on inaccurate foreign imposed nomenclature, the narrator really urges the auteur here to respect the multiple Indigenous groups' self-naming practices. And he thus calls attention to a trans-Pacific history of Indigenous dispossession and denial of self-representation, so both in Vietnam and the United States. So white American settlers on Turtle Island and anti-colonial ethnic majority Viet Kinh in Vietnam, aided in part by American interventionists during the Vietnam War, colonized Indigenous lands during their respective nation-building projects. And indeed, by drawing attention to parallels between the Navajo, Apache, and Comanche, and then on the other hand, the Bru, the Nung, and the Thai, as we can see in this quote, the narrator maps historical linkages, right, between American westward expansion across North America into Indigenous territory and American imperial reach across Pacific islands such as Guam into Southeast Asia. So he makes visible, in other words, what I'm calling a trans-Pacific settler colonial condition. So now I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'll just sort of close up here. So in sum, the trans-Pacific settler colonial condition emphasizes connections between sort of three main things. So first, the fact that during the Vietnam War, the US military called enemy territory in Vietnam Indian country, right? So this sort of term that was on the continental US imposed then on Vietnam. The elongated history of American colonization of Pacific islands such as Guam that actually made intervention into Vietnam and Southeast Asia possible. And then we have the North and South Vietnamese government's own settler colonial policies of forcefully assimilating Indigenous minorities in Southeast Asia. So Asian American historical fiction, in turn, makes legible these genealogies of the trans-Pacific settler colonial condition, which has formally been occluded in Asian American studies scholarly focus during the 1980s and 90s on questions of immigration, assimilation, and liberal inclusion, which makes it sort of seem why this turn to Asian settler colonialism and Asian Indigenous connections seems like a relatively recent phenomenon, which in actuality, I'm arguing it's not. It has a much longer genealogy. So lastly, just to close up, I want to connect this concept of the trans-Pacific settler colonial condition to my forthcoming book, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine, which addresses a lot of similar themes. So broadly, this book asks, what happens when refugees encounter Indigenous sovereignty struggles in the countries of their resettlement? So it examines two case studies. So from April to November 1975, the US military processed over 112,000 Vietnamese refugees on the unincorporated territory of Guam. And then from 1977 to 79, the state of Israel granted asylum and citizenship to 366 non-Jewish Vietnamese refugees with no consultation with the Palestinian people. So the book, Archipelago of Resettlement, analyzes these two cases to theorize what I call the refugee settler condition. So thinking about really the fraught positionality of refugee subjects whose resettlement in a settler colonial state is predicated on the unjust dispossession of an Indigenous population. So how can we think about decolonization and refugees' role in decolonization given these complex dynamics? So I'll go ahead and end there, but I'd love to hear from you if the Trans-Pacific settler colonial condition, or what I'm calling the refugee settler condition, connects with any of your sort of thinking or projects. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was really helpful, really great. All right, so for our next presenter, sorry, let me lower my Zoom hand for a moment. Our next presenter is Toshiaki Komura. He's the author of Lost in American Elegiac Poetry, Tracing Inaccessible Grief from Stevens to Post 9/11. That was published in 2020. And this monograph was also awarded the ALSJ Book Prize. He received a PhD in English literature from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and an MFA from Cornell University. He is an associate professor of English at Kobe College with a primary teaching field in American literature. His main research fields include modern and contemporary poetry, elegy studies, and translation studies. And his presentation is titled Memory and Empathy, the Reconstructive Reception of Japanese American Internment Camp Poetry.
Thank you, Nancy, for your introduction, and also for organizing this panel. And I'm going to share my PowerPoint. In order to discuss the themes laid out in the title of my paper, namely the interaction between memory and empathy in the reconstructive reception of Japanese American internment camp poetry, I begin this paper with three conceptual premises. First is the idea that poetry expresses and embodies empathy. My disclaimer is that I'm invoking this connection between poetry and empathy strictly for the purpose of this particular paper and to discuss an instance of communal grief and suffering, as Martin Espada does in a poetry anthology entitled What Saves Us. Here, I'm not making a general claim about whether or not literature can make people empathic. The idea of literature as a vehicle of empathy has been a subject of ongoing debates, and my intervention in those debates is outside of the scope of this paper. What I'm interested in for this paper is the question of what kind of empathy that this body of poetry expresses or embodies, and how empathic poetics can help codify more ethical ways of reconstructing cultural memories. The second conceptual premise is the notion of disenfranchised grief or disenfranchised suffering. The concept of disenfranchised grief was first introduced by psychologist Kenneth J. Dawka in the 1980s, and it generally refers to a type of grief that is personally felt but not socially recognized. Disenfranchised suffering is its applied idea, a type of suffering that the sufferer experiences, but the society at large does not acknowledge as existent, or even if it exists, serious. This concept has been used to refer to various phenomena, including pet loss, where people's attitude toward the death vary by how they feel about companion creatures, and the AIDS epidemic, where people's views of the casualties vary by how they feel about the population that was initially hardest hit by the epidemic, namely the gay community. Generally speaking, more traditional and socially accepted losses have less room to result in disenfranchised grief, while non-traditional and socially marginalized loss is almost invariably subject to some degree of perceptible disenfranchisement. The Japanese American internment camp experience is not entirely socially unrecognized, but its loss and suffering can nonetheless be characterized as disenfranchised at times because of the social variance in how it has been acknowledged. For instance, a person who regards Uyamatsu v. United States as an appropriate precedent for the 2017 Muslim ban would have a different perception of the camp experience than someone who is outraged by the COVID era anti-Asian sentiments. In 2018, the height of the Trump era, a monograph published from the Cambridge University Press refers to internment as relocation and depicts it as something not much different than a summer camp. These scholarly examples are not many, but they do exist, and these divergent social realities create and sustained disenfranchisement. Even just the fact that the Japanese American internment camp has been referred to in different ways, whether it's internment, incarceration, concentration, or relocation, testifies to the lack of national consensus and hence an element of disenfranchisement about how to make sense of this experience. The third conceptual premise is that memory is fundamentally reconstructive, and that the similar principle of reconstructive memory applies to literary memory as well. According to the tenets of reconstructive memory, one's memory is subject to distortion by cognitive interventions, such as individual perceptions, social influences, and world knowledge that one possesses. A similar phenomenon occurs in literary reception. The reception of a literary text is subject to mercurial critical interventions that are shaped by individual perceptions, social influences, and the reader's world knowledge. What it means is that a perception or interpretation of a literary work is dependent on the overlay of reconstructive memory and reconstructive reception, whereby current events, social environment, and the reader's individual understanding and perception of them influence how the reader regards the literary text. The corollary to the idea is that because subsequent generations of writers write in response and reaction to the works of previous generations of writers, their work in effect engages with both the reconstructive historical memory and the reconstructive literary memory. In other words, the body of work that comprises Japanese American internment camp poetry not only depicts the loss and grief of the internment experience that occurred in the 1940s, but also responds to the social environment at the time the work was written, as well as to the reception of the works of the previous generation. For instance, the second generation Japanese American internment camp poetry, which was typically written in the 1970s and the 80s, engages with both the post-civil rights movement sentiments and the contemporary reception of the first generation Japanese American internment camp poetry, which was written in the 40s and the 50s. So this is the long introduction to lay out the three conceptual premises of the paper, namely the function of poetry as this expression and embodiment and empathy, the concept of disenfranchised grief, and the reconstructed nature of historical and literary memory. In this context, I'm going to track on three generations of three generations of Japanese American internment camp poetry. I will examine Toyo Suemoto's work as part of the first generation of this group, and Lawson Kusao Inada's work as the second generation, and Claire Kageyama's work as the third generation. The terminology here needs clarification. What I refer to as the first generation of Japanese American internment camp poetry was generally written during the internment years or in the decades thereafter by the US-born second generation Japanese Americans who were adults at the time of the incarceration. What I refer to as the second generation of this poetry was usually written in the post-civil rights movement environment of the 1970s and 80s by the third generation Japanese Americans who were infants or small children at the time of the incarceration. What I refer to as the third generation of this body of work was typically written in the 21st century by subsequent generations who were born in the post-war period. One of the arguments of this paper is that the works of each of these generations engage with both the social environment at the time when it was written and with the aesthetics and approaches of the previous generation's work. For the first generation of Japanese American internment camp poetry, I'm going to be talking about Toyo Suemoto's poems. And Suemoto was born in 1916 in Oroville, California. She was a second generation immigrant, which is often referred to as Nisei. She grew up in Sacramento, graduated with a major in English and Latin from the University of California, Berkeley in 1937, and was camp librarian at the Topaz Public Library during the final years of internment. Uyamatsu's literary influences have been traced to Sarah Teasdale, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Langston Hughes, Louis Bogan, among others. But her primary influence was Emily Dickinson, as evidenced by many of her poems, including this poem called Sand. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read this aloud, but I'll put it out there as an example. Another prominent feature of Uyamatsu's camp poetry is the imagery of grass. In the American poetic tradition, it is hard to escape Whitman when one invokes grass imagery. To quote a passage from Song of Myself, growing among Black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe Congressman Cuff. I give them the same, I receive them the same. In a poem entitled Tangforan Assembly Center, Uyamatsu observes how the grass grew through the floor between uneven planks. In Whitman, to put it rather reductively, grass represents the romanticized imagery of democratic egalitarianism. Uyamatsu's invocation is nuanced and metacognitive. Grass grows the same among the internees as it does among other people, even in a site where the principles of egalitarianism that it represents are being violated. One of the commonly held views about Japanese American incarceration during World War II is that shame and silence were generally the response of the incarcerated generations, and that the subsequent generations who were informed by the civil rights movement and the growth of ethnic studies in the 60s and 70s were the driving force for remembrance and reparations, triggering the governmental move toward redress in the 80s. As Trace Yamamoto explains, this picture is not quite accurate, or at least does not capture the entire landscape. In particular, Japanese American literary community cannot be characterized as silent. At the Poston camp, a widely circulated anonymous poem entitled That Damned Fence referred to the barbed wire that surrounded the camp as follows, quote, "We are trapped like rats in a wild cage to fret and fume with impotent rage," end of quote. At the Topaz camp, Uyamatsu contributed to the camp literary magazine entitled Trek. Uyamatsu was respectfully referred to by later generations of Japanese American poets as, quote, "our major camp poet and Nikkei poet laureate," end of quote. The second generation of internment camp poetry was penned by the third generation immigrants who were infants or small children at the time of incarceration. Lawson Fusawa Inada belongs to this group. Inada was born in 1938, and at the age of 3, he and his family were interned at camps in Fresno, Arkansas, and Colorado. His 1993 collection, Legends from Camp, is the best known of his internment camp-related poetry. The poem that I will briefly discuss here is from his next collection, Drawing the Lines, published in 1997, and it's entitled Healing Hilla. Healing Hilla references the Gila River internment camp, but its historical reach goes beyond the World War II experience. The poem traces a history of this land from its origin, how it was quote, lush land once graced by a gifted people, gifted with the wisdom of rivers, season, irrigation, end of quote. The pivotal 9th stanza understated sums up this history. Then came the nation, then came the death, then came the desert, then came the camp. The impulse here is inclusivity, a move beyond one's own suffering. There was a post-war effort to turn internment camps into a nest of national loyalty and model minority, in which the camps were credited for helping to cultivate barren deserts into arable land. Inada's poem sees through this duplicity. In the American literary imagination, the frontier is a romanticized space of freedom, independence, and a specific kind of American stoicism. Previous studies have noted how Japanese American artists depicted the internment camp environment as a source of both hope and hardship. In one sense, one could characterize Japanese American internment camp art as assimilative, embodying precisely the type of American stoicism that is championed in the mainstream culture. In another sense, however, Inada's desert imagery exposes the place to be more nuanced and complicated than what the popular imagination holds. Healing Hilla refers to the internment camp site as that massive void. For later generations of Japanese Americans for whom the experience was a vague memory, or for whom the camp is a cultural memory but not personal experience, the sense of void or absence pervades their poetic sensibilities. Claire Kageyama belongs to the generation that was not born at the time of the interment. In a sequence of poem entitled Shadow Mountain, Kageyama traces her family history to Manzana, where her father was interned as a child, along with her grandparents. One poem entitled Tertsonal Manzana Riot refers to itself as a poem with missing details. The sense of absence pervades this sequence of poems. Psychoanalysts Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok explore the effect of intergenerational trauma in a book entitled The Shell and the Kernel, and they propose a concept called phantom to describe trauma with an inaccessible origin. A phantom is difficult to exorcise because the object loss, the origin of the trauma, is buried in a metaphorical illegal burial ground, and it is hard to locate. Because intergenerational trauma is not rooted in one's own experience or lifetime, it is like a shadow without substance, creating a low-grade melancholy that haunts and persists. Seen from this panoramic view, these poems offer amendments to the desert, frontier, and grass imageries of the American literary camp tradition. What these three generations of poetry also teach us is the importance of metacognizing the present moment. Each generation of poetry tells us about its era as much as it does about how we see those eras, namely our own ways of seeing and our own sense of what we want to see. They also suggest that, particularly in the current period, the work of the progressive inclusion of disenfranchised suffering may best be understood in comparison with what Martha Nussbaum, in her 2016 work entitled Anger and Forgiveness, refers to as transitional anger. Nussbaum defines transitional anger as a future-oriented affect with the aim toward effecting change, in contrast with traditional garden variety anger, which she characterizes as a regressive affect involving a connotation of payback. The stoicism of Japanese American internment camp poetry, particularly ones that were written in the 1940s and the 50s, has often been foreignized and exoticized as a peculiar Japanese cultural expression of perseverance, resignation, or reticence, while at the same time as assimilated as akin to that of the American frontier spirit. Although this view of Japanese American experience may not be entirely incorrect, I would argue that it is not a particularly useful way of conceptualizing the enterprise of this body of poetry. While the inclusive contradiction of first generation of Japanese American internment camp poetry may have been born of necessity when forces and motives to legitimize the incarceration were powerful, its elements of cross-ethnic pollination can be isolated and reevaluated as a choice as part of formulating a more ethical and empathic ways of reconstructing cultural memories. I think that's about time, I'm assuming.
Yes, I mean, thank you. If you want to have a closing comment, any other closing comments, fine as well.
Okay, I just have one more paragraph.
Go for it.
Ultimately, the three generations of Japanese American internment camp poetry that I've examined in this paper participated in the enterprise of Nussbaum's notion of transitional affect. Their deliberate use of the desert imagery, frontier imagery, and grass imagery is both an inheritance of and amendment to the modern American poetic lineage of Dickinson and Whitman. By infusing these amended imageries into the fabric of poetic tradition, this body of poetry allows for the completion of cross-ethnic literary inheritance process, and that, I would argue, is the future-oriented character of the transitional affect of this body of poetry. And that's the end of my paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So many connections. I can't wait for our discussion at the end. So I also thank all the presenters for being really great with time because, we discussed how we wanted to make sure we had time for discussion at the end. Our third presentation is by Raquel Mentor. She is a graduate student at La Sierra University, currently in her second year of studies and hoping to using all her knowledge for future work as a professor in the college and higher education sector. And her paper is titled Amy Uyamatsu and the Yellow Power Movement.
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. So I can just share my screen. Definitely, I can resonate with the feeling that we are going to see a lot of connections between the topics that we are discussing today. And so my topic, the Yellow Power Movement and Amy Uyamatsu's poetry will tie in really closely to the last presentation, which is great. So in this presentation, we're going to be looking through and understanding Uyamatsu's historical and cultural background, reviewing a brief overview of Uyamatsu's life. We're going to be reading an excerpt from her first major publication, which is called The Emergence of Yellow Power. And we're going to conclude with analyzing her poem called Deliberate, which should echo some of the experiences that she wrote in her first collegiate opinion piece. So Uyamatsu is considered Sansei. She came from, or her parents, the Issei and the Nisei, were part of the generation that experienced the internment camps in Manzanar. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, Executive Order 9066 called all Japanese Americans and immigrants to relocate to internment camps. And this is part of her story and her upbringing. Of course, the propaganda that was involved with that was very, very negative. It was made to instill fear into the average American who saw somebody of Asian descent. And so as a result, of course, there was a lot of trauma involved in being interned, not only just in having to leave everything that you knew behind, but also in having this new stigma placed upon you as somebody who's violent and dangerous, and just everybody is out to hurt people. And so as a result, we see here this quote from former President Truman. He writes, "The only language they, being the Japanese, seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him like a beast. It is most regrettable, but nevertheless true." So the Second World War didn't end until September 1945, but the internment camp still continued a year after until 1946. More than that, the United States government took 46 years to officially extend an apology to the Japanese community for their unlawful internment. And while there was restitution of $20,000, many of the people who were interned at the time actually passed away, and others claimed that that just was not enough money for all of the things that they had lost in the process. As a result, the amount of trauma that came from that really caused the Japanese community to be afraid of sharing their culture and their traditions with the generations coming after them. And that is the kind of culture and world that Amy Uyamatsu fell into. There was a very strong emphasis on assimilation. There was a very strong emphasis on Americanization and being able to blend in so as to not seem threatening. So in comes Amy Uyamatsu, and this is just a very brief biography of who she is. She was born in 1947 in Pasadena, California. Now, as an English person and a lot less of a history person, dates escape me quickly. So if you're like me, 1947 was about 2 years after the official release of the internment camps. She grew up in a post-World War II world, but her parents and grandparents, again, were in these internment camps. She went to school because of her father to study math. However, her passion was always with writing and English. During her undergraduate program, she published The Emergence of Yellow Power, and this has become her most widely published piece, even though later on she went to write 5 books, in most of it being poetry again, including being part of many anthologies. She taught over 25 years at Venice High School, and to my knowledge, she is still alive today, though a little bit hard to track down. So entering into that background that Amy Uyamatsu grew up in, we now come back to the 1960s, which again is one of these recurring topics this afternoon. Many African Americans were already experiencing issues of race, especially during the Watts riots, which were very, in the news and everything, especially in Los Angeles. Being a native to Pasadena and going to school at UCLA, she saw firsthand a lot of the issues going on. In this quote, in the aftermath of the Watts riots, the apparent contrast between successful Japanese Americans and angry African Americans would become fixed in America's racial consciousness. In 1966, the New York Times was the first of many mainstream publications to hold up Japanese American integration as a lesson for Black America. So in a larger sense, the Japanese community was being re-traumatized for first having to go through these internment camps, and when they assimilated and tried to Americanize themselves as much as they could so that they wouldn't stand out, they are now being used as a cause or as an example set because they weren't fighting back largely during the internment camps and the times that followed. They tried to fall back into a pattern so as to not stand out. And that is when Amy Uyamatsu actually starts speaking up. And so this is an excerpt that really speaks to the whole theme of her paper, The Emergence of Yellow Power. It says, in the process of Americanization, Asians try to transform themselves into white men, both mentally and physically. Mentally, they have adjusted to the white man's culture by giving up their own languages, customs, histories, and cultural values. They have adopted the American way of life, only to discover that is not enough. If you so choose, I would highly recommend that you read the rest of this paper. The fact that she wrote this during her undergraduate time at UCLA just really speaks to how heavy of a burden this was on her heart. This was written more as an opinion piece. However, the themes that she speaks of here become a recurring theme in many of her poems, as we will see in one of her poetry examples. So this is from her first book, Nights of Fire, Nights of Rain. This is written many years after probably about 30 years after she first published The Emergence of Yellow Power in 1997. And this is a very short poem, so we're gonna, again, spend some time looking at it and just really seeing how she still had this message in her heart. So, excuse me. It says, so by 16, we move in packs, learn to strut and slide, in deliberate low down rhythm, talk in syncopated beat, because we want so bad to be cool, never to be mistaken for white, even when we leave these rowdier LA streets. Remember how we paint our eyes like gangsters, flash our legs in nylons, sassy black heels or 2-inch zippered boots, stack them by the door at night next to Daddy's muddy gardening shoes. And while she was very prolific writing in that opinionated voice, she also showed that same skill in using different techniques in order to get her point across in this poem. So first off, she uses some alliteration. She uses words like strut and slide and we want, recurring with, white, when, we, high heels. And so there is a pattern to it, almost like a song. If you look up syncopated beat, it actually is a style of music that she was referring to during this time. And it was a style of music that a lot of minorities were coming into. And again, going back into the Black community, that she was looking to as a reference point for the Japanese people to look up to and to say, hey, it's time to break away from our assimilation. The next form was assonance. And so again, we have those recurring songs almost to make it melodic. Be, we, leave, streets, we, heels, and in the end with muddy and gardening. And the most prominent part towards the end is that juxtaposition. She compares these high heels and zippered boots right next to daddy's muddy gardening shoes. And it was shown again, part of that assimilation was trying to become that friendly neighbor next door. So the person who tends to their garden and who makes sure to be friendly and is out in the community as a person who's just falling into the patterns of a middle-class American family lifestyle. However, this poem is very pointedly saying, we're not going to be wearing the muddy gardening shoes and, aiming for that white picket fence dream. We're going to be wearing our very out there clothing. We're going to have, the black heels and the zippered boots, and we're going to be out late at night, almost like a teenage anthem to deciding, this is not what we're going to fall into. Our generation is not going to be like the generations before us. And finally, we look at illusions. When they're talking about the rowdier LA streets, remember how we paint our eyes like gangsters. They're looking at the traditions of a lot of the Hispanic communities that were, again, in one central area in Los Angeles. You didn't only have the African-American communities there, but you had a very peak moment in the barrios and the way that people were dressing at that time. And she's calling again for that decision to stand out, particularly through dress. So just some concluding thoughts. The emergence of yellow power made such wide circulation because it was a piece that needed to be spoken at a time when many Asian minorities, and specifically looking at Japanese minorities, had still not found their voice. Deliberate, Amy Uyamatsu's later poem places her back into the mentality of that adolescent Japanese American girl living during the civil rights movement. Instead of continuing to choose assimilation, she and her peers did everything to stand out, from demeanor to dress to publishing pieces in favor of going against the grain. So that's kind of the gist of my presentation. I'm sorry if I went a little bit early on that.
No, it's great. There's no such thing as too early. Thank you so much, Raquel. That was wonderful. All right, and then for our final presentation, we have Dr. Michelle, sorry, let me pull up your about here. Dr. Michelle Ellia Tombi Obrien, and they are associate professor in the English department and the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Central Washington University on Yakama Nation land. Their teaching and research focuses on Asian diasporic literatures and theory, forced migration, and comparative raciality. Their current co-led project, Cosmopolitan Possibilities, connects recent graphic memoirs from diasporic Southeast Asian writers to earlier Australian archives that include multicultural graphic narratives. And Michelle's presentation is the digital autographics and storing Chinatowns in Fred Wa's Hai Muckamuck Plain Chinese.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen. There we go. So for a little bit of transparency, I'm due to some technical difficulties, I'm currently tethering to my phone. So when I get to the clips in my presentation that have video attached to it, I'll turn off my video just to hopefully optimize things and means I can still stay connected to Zoom. And thank you everyone for sticking around, Nancy for organizing this. And again, just want to identify that I'm coming from Yakama Nation land, specifically the land of the Shawanogan people. All right, so throughout the pandemic in North America, as we know, incidents of anti-Asian hate in Vancouver's Chinatown increased over 700%, including acts of vandalism and physical violence against Chinatown residents and business owners. While the primary residents of Vancouver's Chinatown were historically Chinese immigrants, its development follows the socio-historic structure of most North American Chinatowns that emerged in the 19th century, where other Asian migrants, particularly from Southeast Asia, were obliged to reside in less desirable areas at the fringes of towns, which eventually created a diversified Asian community with vital connections to Asian diasporic movements of goods and peoples. But news reports about the shifts in Chinatown has long obliterated this history and now almost exclusively reduced Chinatown to a site that is, quote, dirty, battered by crime, and a dying site of Chinese heritage in North America, given both this increased violence and intensified gentrification. Chinatown in the media and prevailing public discourse remains an enclave of disrepair, a static site with particular boundaries, and a location whose significance is based on its physical significance. This rendering of Chinatown erases its ongoing presence as a heterogeneous space of intersection between inhabitants and the mainstream, characterized by shifting processes of subjectivity, ethnic negotiation, and affiliation, where, as Gita Rajan proposes, such site of home are also, quote, places of desires and dreams in the diasporic imagination that carry within them a vital history of the compensatory exercising of balancing longing with belonging. This paper focuses on an artistic intervention that captures an alternative narrativization of Chinatowns, not as linked to physical space alone, but as a theoretical and psychic space of vibrant diasporic community. I focus on the digital autographic Hai Muckamuck, Playing Chinese, an online multimedia archive which uses interactive poetry, drawings, film clips, oral histories, and music by videographers, artists, historians, and designers to remix the history of Chinese migrants in the Pacific Northwest while remaining grounded in Chinese-Canadian poet Fred Waugh's documentary poetics, or docupoetics. Autographics, as termed by life writing scholar Gillian Whitlock, refers to a particular kind of autobiography, where visual imagery and written text intertwine to allow for various narrative subject positions to be negotiated. Digital autographics harness the interactivity of new media, are a crucial medium to capture the competing narratives that define migrant trajectories through what Daniela Trimboli expresses as an unbridling of the conventional biographical narrative frame to draw, often literally a drawing in, of multiple migrant pasts into the present simultaneously. I propose here that this digital autographic project vitally documents Waugh's history, but does so while refusing what Waugh refers to as the, quote, ready-made generic expectations of the standard autobiographical form. Hai Muckamuck instead demands that audiences make associations between the intersections of Waugh's history and the multiplicity of narrative histories from Chinatown residents to create a broader repository of migration, one that allows rooms for the fissures, multitudes of perspectives, and unexpected connections within this history. Interspersed with Waugh's poetics and audio recordings about migration, settlement, and the concept of Chinatown are images of community space and archival documentation of the racist exclusionary policies that define the history of Asian settlement in North America. Yet if audiences try to follow a linear trajectory through this digital narrative, they are instead forced back into random vignettes that capture scenes and oral narratives of everyday life set throughout the history of various Chinatowns in the Pacific Northwest, and even sites of migration across the Pacific. In doing so, the project figures Chinatowns not only as localized and geographically bounded sites, but also as interconnected and embodied narratives that persist even as these locales are physically altered. So Fred Waugh studied under the experimental American poets in the 1960s, but he's best known as one of Canada's most prolific poets. And his collection, Diamond Grill, is a seminal text in Asian Canadian studies for its exploration of hybridity and race in small town Canada through poetic vignettes that document events that take place at the titular cafe run by Waugh's father. Waugh describes Diamond Grill as a biotext, a self-conscious attempt to prevent Waugh's writing from being, quote, hijacked by ready-made generic expectations such as the novel, autobiography, and life writing, end quote. By using formal innovations, including anti-grammatical sentences, run-on stream of conscious phrasing, imagined memories, and linguistic disruptions that resist predictable forms of narration. Another linguistic strategy Waugh deploys is the use of Chinook pidgin, which Hai Muckamuck, a term that means big shot or important person, comes from. George Lang describes Chinook as a settler language set within, quote, the cataclysmic transformation of indigenous societies and a desire for community beyond those to which its speakers were bound by racial polemics. Wa's families negotiated their migration and settlement in part by using this hybrid lingua franca that enabled them to connect to other migratory communities and First Nations people that visited their diner. Take, for instance, this moment where Wa describes a singular memory of the kitchen. And the prairie sun over the mountains to the east, over my family's shoulder. The journal journey tilts tight-fisted through the gutter of the book, avoiding a place to start or end. Maps don't have beginnings, just edges, some frayed and hazy margin of possibility, absence, gaps. Shouts in the kitchen, fish on, side of fries, over easy, on brown, you mucka high. The sudden shifts from the site of the small town Chinese restaurant kitchen to memory of migration, to a refusal to fix the origin of his family's migratory history, to the hybrid linguistic forms of Chinook used by the grill's Chinese cooks, underscores Wa's use of biofiction to gradually unravel what he refers to as the multiple possible narrative threads a life can be. Conveys how his early life always intersected with other cultural expressive elements which continue to interject and intrude into his daily life in the context of settler colonialism in Canada, and are temporarily isolated but effectively recurrent as he documents his family's history. In doing so, the conception of diasporic identity in Wa's work is, as Cynthia Sugars argues, transformed from a synchronous marker to one of, quote, disjunctive temporality, a spatio-temporal movement highlighted through the collapsing multiple moments into one lyric phrase. I mentioned Diamond Grill as the docupoetics within Hai Muckamuck extend from this print biotext and emerge from Wa's earlier meditations on capturing elements of Chinese migratory histories in Canada, while also entangling this history with other sites, peoples, and narratives. Hai Muckamuck begins in British Columbia, but as readers click through images and traverse the different sites, they are gradually connected with scenes from different Chinatowns elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and eventually to the Pacific Rim broadly. The interactive site begins with the script describing a man taking a lottery card out of his pocket, and then a drawing of a Pakapoo lottery card, a game popular in the 19th century at the contact zone between European settlers and Chinese migrants during the gold rush. Readers are invited to become Hai Muckamucks who can play the lottery, staging a position of power and assume no ability the project soon disrupts. They then click on the card and begin playing Chinese, which a page within the project identifies as both a reference made to the mimesis within diaspora and community building, as well as assumptions about the specific tropes expected of Asian migrants. The coding of playing Chinese is further addressed as readers click through a map of British Columbia that is embedded on the outline of a body, where the body carries within it the different sites and narratives that comprise Wa's and others' histories. Readers navigate through different sites and read Wa's docupoetics throughout. One vignette, Gates, identifies such tropes through detailing the life of an individual from Wa's family entering their restaurant. A troublemaker, that one, a yellow peril. I won't read all of the different slurs throughout, but a celestial, a royal commission cuckoo, an Asiatic exclusion league problem, a huckster, a leper, a depraved opium addict, a slant-eyed devil, a Mongolian, a heathen, bone-scraping ghoul, a pest, a wanton Cyprian, a coolie, just another yellow belly, just another last spike. The list of historical racial pejoratives and stereotypes all emerged during the 19th century as Chinese migrants built the Trans-Pacific and transcontinental railways in North America, the reference to the last spike, which is then connected in Hai Muckamuck to the ongoing effects of these histories through audio oral history files, where Cameron Wa, who owned a Chinese restaurant close to the Diamond Grill, identifies hearing similar racial slurs from white settlers in the 1950s and 70s at home and in unidentified Chinatowns. He then comments, "It's okay, I figured. I'm a Chihuahua and they're German Shepherds. They can bite me anytime, but I just bark." And the sound of laughter can then be heard in the background. Readers accessing these narratives are confronted simultaneously with the violence therein, but also the community and connection that was always embedded in this history through the laughter of the interlocutors, the other developers of the project, all from diasporic backgrounds, which complicates any expectations that playing Chinese is a singular experience rather than negotiating multiple positions simultaneously. From even the vignettes set geographically separate from the physical location of official Chinatowns, Chinatown emerges through the reference to Gates and the oral history file as a psychic space and a resonant metonym for the uneasily resolved locus of migrant identity, whose multiple historical and material realities are most viscerally embraced. And further navigational clicks will eventually lead readers to one of the many Chinatowns on the west coast of North America. Along different sites, readers are greeted both by the image of different Chinatown gates, the sounds of traditional flute playing mixed with modern Cantonese and Mandarin pop songs, as well as the sounds of people moving through these Chinatowns, speaking multiple languages, including Taiwanese Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Tagalog. Rather than situate these Chinatowns within one specific temporal period, the audio and drawings on the site collapse 300 years of histories. Readers can click on different individuals with snippets of oral history attached to them, such as one from the 2000s of a young Chinese man in Canada whose Chinese American girlfriend is referred to as hollow bamboo for being too westernized, standing by two men working on a Canadian railway from the 19th century, with a vignette from Wong referring to the last spike and head tax. The poetic text here references the influx of Chinese workers who constructed the Pacific Railway before the Canadian federal government passed the 1885 Chinese Immigration Act, which stipulated that every person of Chinese origin immigrating to Canada had to pay a head tax fee of $50. Following the passage of the head tax, more Chinese migrants were effectively forced into smaller, inexpensive enclaves to support each other, which also furthered the development of Chinatowns. As Maria Ng notes, this shift reinforced, quote, a stereotype of unassimilability and resistance to acculturation is an image that feeds the suspicion harbored by the non-Chinese against an allegedly enclosed and inscrutable people. In Hai Muckamuck, the juxtaposition of this history of exclusion against the narrative of Chinese American individual viewed as not Chinese enough within the space of modern Chinatown yokes together these experiences across North America. It reflects what Schumann identifies as how developing Chinatowns was grounded in, quote, the need for social and cultural support from fellow sojourners and the need to maintain ethnic identity and kinship ties with China to choose ways of life reminiscent of home, amid a society intent on their inclusion, and how modern concerns about individual westernization are influenced by this. Such scenes deftly gesture towards the tension between retaining particular Chinese cultural identity elements and the development of a distinct but interrelated identity, Chinese, Canadian, or American, in North America. By extending his family's history to include this broader tension in Chinatown, Wong also communicates the productiveness of thinking of these autobiographical elements relates to his own complex identity as necessarily affiliated with them and their individual lives. The use of imagery here is also vital, at once attaching these experiences to individuals by positioning them visually within the same space, figuring Chinatown as both present as past as a repository of these stories. As Wong begins to inscribe the formation and constitution of Chinatowns, representation of this diasporic space becomes more multi-layered, acknowledging what Radhakrishnan here refers to as the, quote, imperatives of an earlier elsewhere in an active and critical relationship with the cultural politics of one present home, all within the figurarity of reciprocal displacement, end quote. Indeed, as readers click through the multiple oral histories, videos of Chinatowns, docupoetic vignettes, and images, they're consistently forced to different sites outside Chinatown, eventually arriving and then re-arriving at the Pacific Rim. The primary image is no longer of the autographic body, but images of boats on the water that link to vignettes about migration more broadly, but specifically about the interconnection between Chinatown and Asian influence throughout the Pacific. A cigarette made in Russia based on a Chinese label that looks like a camel and popular in Germany from Vietnamese street vendors communicates both the presence of other Asian communities in Chinatown, particularly those from Southeast Asia, as well as commerce throughout the Pacific, which subtextually complexifies stereotypical and dominant renderings of Chinatown as culturally uniform or as harboring expectations of authenticity and exoticism. Instead, the vignette plays with Chineseness here to convey its many imperialistic and cultural intersections, Russia, Turkey, and the USA through the reference to the production of Camel cigarettes, Germany, and then Vietnamese migration. A second vignette also communicates the multitudes within this cultural history without attempting to resolve it for readers. Pacific Ocean steamers, full of dreamers, win yourself or lose yourself. As readers are resituated from Chinatown back to the side of the boat, and as they click through to attempt to find some type of linear connection back to Chinatown, they are met with instances of uncertainty and unknowability. This mapping reflects the poetic line's precise potential for those who migrate through the Pacific more broadly to find sites of affiliation identity that allow them to win themselves, or the many sites of rejection, racism, cultural diffusion, and exclusion that would cause not just Chinese migrants, but Asian migrants more broadly to lose themselves. Wong again returns to the autographical and the dynamic nature of communities within Chinatown, as the text embedded in the corner of the Pacific eventually takes readers back to Richmond, a poem and site of one of the Chinatowns included in the site, and a billboard over the Chinatown gates that reads, H-1B problems, pivot to Canada, next to a recording of planes landing and people entering houses. The video subtitles read, is this a dream? Now here we go again. It wasn't right. I had to pay my way. You know it. Like the boat that brought me here, in the sadness of remembering what I'd left and what I dreamed for. The poetic persona here referencing the unfairness of the Chinese head tax and challenges of Pacific boat migration is integrated with a billboard, an actual billboard paid for by Citizenship and Immigration Canada located in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, to attract Asian migrants who struggled to get an H-1B work visa and instead apply for Canadian work visa. Here, the past exploitation of Chinese workers in Canada that affected Wa's family is connected to the fraught visa processes in both the USA and Canada that disproportionately reject South Asian and Southeast Asian applicants who later apply for residency by devaluing their qualifications and skills. As these scenes map how historical anti-Asian exclusion resonates with the modern immigration system, it again creates a larger, temporally unbounded community of Asian migrants in North America. Chinatown here isn't a singular site, but connective tissue between past and present, a physically unfixed sensibility of community that tethers together those who have yet to arrive with those in the United States, communicating how, as Sugars notes, such diasporic locations can be sites of radical reorientation, of language, of subjectivity.
I think we lost the audio there for a moment. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing this.
Yeah, I think we might have lost Michelle.
Okay, maybe they will pop in soon. Okay, well, thankfully they got through most of the presentation. Hopefully they'll pop back soon so we can have the discussion. Yeah, that was, I really enjoyed it. It was great. I just want to just sort of spatially, I kind of like how spatially we started out with this discussion of just like these trans-Pacific connections. And then we went to the sort of the American frontier imaginary, right? And with the displacement, with the internment and relocation. And as Evan pointed out, we have the connections to also the displacement of Native Americans in that. And then, we moved on with Raquel to sort of the urban centers, the cities. And as there's also the comparative racialization connections. And then we move up to Pacific Northwest, and then Michelle ended their presentation looking at the images of the coast and the Trans-Pacific connection. So I was like, oh, this is brilliant. Now we're back to the Trans-Pacific connection. So it's almost like I'm like the mentalist, the magician guy from earlier. I already could read all your minds about your presentations, and I orchestrated this way ahead of time. No, I'm just kidding. So anyways, let's while we, I'm not sure when / if Michelle will pop back. So let's go ahead and get started with a discussion. If any of our 2 audience members that stayed with us till the end, thank you very much. I know there were a few other people that were popping in and out. But if any of you guys have comments, or if any of the panelists have questions or comments for each other, we have about 15 minutes.
I guess I have a question. I guess I would just invite Toshiaki and Raquel. There's a lot of connections, I think, between your 2 presentations, sort of thinking about these multiple generations of internment camp and Japanese American poetry. So I'd love to just hear you talk, I guess, about your impressions of each other's papers and how it might inform your projects.
Well, definitely seeing the poetry of before informs a little bit as well to how authors of future generations are writing as well. I think that definitely you're going to see a shift in the way that they write. Of course, a lot of the people in the internment camps are going to be writing about those difficult experiences and the trauma that comes with that. But, the trauma of those generations, the 3rd generation, of course, is a different kind of trauma, a feeling of loss, which was something that in my research I came across time and time again, loss of culture, loss of tradition. And, that's really what my poet was speaking to, was this idea that we need to go back and find our roots and our culture, even though, they want us to get rid of it, we need to find it once more.
Yes, one of the things, first of all, I appreciated Raquel's talk about the Uyamatsu's essay, which I was not aware of, and so that was something new that I learned today. And also, I also another thing that I found very fascinating was how Raquel was talking about the aesthetics of the poetry. For one thing, when people talk about Asian American literature, oftentimes we poetry people are marginalized, so it was nice to see that there are so many other panelists that talked about poetry today. But aside from that, another thing another tension that you often see, and especially in ethnic studies, is that the focus on the political and in suppressing the aesthetics. And I think there was the title of the book escapes my head, but there was a book from, I believe, Stanford University Press that was comparing Latinx literature and Asian American literature in terms of aesthetics. And I think that what Raquel was referring to as alliteration, assonance, the aesthetic aspect of the work is something that I'm interested in. My primary background has been the formalist training. I've been formally, my training has been formalist, and so this is a little bit of a new ground that I'm trying to cover. So combining that ethnic studies and the aesthetics aspect of things was another thing that I found interesting. So that's my.
Thank you guys. And I also just wanted to mention like a quick sort of like meta moment I had when Raquel was presenting, where I just thought the whole format of the presentation was so brilliant, because I felt like a student in the greatest sense of the word, right? Like I knew exactly what she was going to talk about, and I was just like, why don't we put in the beginning of presentations like, these are the 3 and 4 things that you're going to hear in this presentation. I just think it's so funny, because most of us, are also teachers, and we all know good instructional practices and things we do that like really help students learn. And we tend to like throw all of that out of the window when we're doing like academic stuff. So I love just seeing that pedagogical aspect in Raquel's presentation. And it was like, I don't know, it was like a little like light bulb to myself, where I was like, yeah, this is like, I learned so much more when I'm being treated like a student and not someone that is able to, auditorily process extremely long sentences for a long duration of time. So yeah, I appreciated that as a teacher. So I have a question for Evan. Do you think, I think in all the presentations today, we a lot of them did gesture and reference towards the relationship between the Asian American settlers and, the connections with indigenous people or being on indigenous land. So I think, that's very much supporting, right, your contention that this is something that is been formative to Asian American as a rubric from the very beginning. Do you see, as you're studying and researching Asian American / Trans-Pacific settler colonialism, that there is also a tension in trying to theorize somewhat uniformly over a myriad of different indigenous experiences? Just because, in the same way that a lot of times, right, in Asian American studies, we talk a lot about how uncomfortable the rubric of Asian American is when you have all these disparate groups with very different sort of just historical genealogies of their migration and in America. So in the kind of that same way, is it very awkward to be theorizing about the displacement of First Nations in Pacific Northwest, and then Hawaii and Guam and the Southwest, like what would, with like the reference in the poem that Toshiaki quoted from Inada. And then, and then even stretching it further and then connecting that to like American colonization of the Philippines and then like neo-imperialism in Vietnam. So sometimes do you feel like it's a little too much of a stretch, and how can scholars bring in more nuance in their analysis while still maintaining some sort of cohesive theorization?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So I think that, with any of these transnational or transpacific analytics, it's always a balance between the specificity, right, of the site and tending to like the specificity of how indigeneity is articulated, as well as like the specificity of like the historical sort of settler colonial violence, right? As well as just like the differing political statuses, which then informs like at each site or space or location, right, what decolonization means and looks like is going to be really different. So, I'm really interested in, so that's like sort of one piece of it, right? On the other hand, I do think that it's important to draw connections, right, and draw really historically grounded and materially grounded, but that's also found and informed by the literature, connections between these different spaces. Partially, I think, for because of this question of coalition building and solidarity, that I think that a lot of my work is sort of like meta-ly invested in, right? So yeah, I think that there's been a lot of really interesting work recently to think about how indigeneity is now operating, for example, within the Asian continent, right? And how, because, I think after the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the early 2000s, that also informed how different groups who might have before articulated their claims to the state within the language of ethnic minorities, right, might then want to pivot and make claims within the language of indigeneity, right, in a particular sort of political relationship to the land, vis-a-vis, what they see as an occupying power or colonial power. So a lot of work has been done, to think about Okinawa and Okinawan activists really taking up this language of indigeneity to critique not only Japan, but also US military bases. And I mentioned this briefly, but, thinking about Vietnam as well, or even the Philippines, right, as both post-colonial states that had struggles against Western colonial powers, but then even within, these nation state structures, the post-colonial state also had an investment in articulating a somewhat homogenous, sort of nation as a sort of nation building effort. And this does really undermine, I think, some of the more sovereignty movements that are existing from, what could be called ethnic minority or indigenous groups, right? Even, as you say, thinking about Native Hawaiians and their struggle, right? They really articulate a critique of what they see as a US occupation, which is very different from how a lot of American Indian activists and groups will articulate their history, right? So the same sort of history of forced displacement into like reservations, as well as boarding schools. That sort of history doesn't resonate as much in places like Hawaii or in Guam or Guahan. So how do we attend to that specificity while also realizing that this sort of rhetoric, I think, that if we just sort of think of like the manifest destiny rhetoric, that really compelled this sort of expansion, which was really a military expansion across the US. And, what are some of the patterns that we see that are justifying and really replicating, right, a lot of this sort of imperial expansion, which then gets articulated as a settler colonial project as well. So I'm really in conversation with Jody Bird's work on transit of empire here. I think her work has been really informative to think about these connections between empire and indigenous displacement. Thanks for the question.
What's the name of the author just said?
Jody Bird. I'll type it in the chat too.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's everything your work is actually really relevant to my own research project. My dissertation is on mixed race characters in contemporary Asian American literature, and I didn't set out to discuss what I'm sort of loosely calling multiple colonialisms, but there's just no way to talk about multiraciality of Asian Americans without looking at the long history of militarized intimacies across all these different times and places. So it's like in every chapter, it's like actually turned out to be like an overarching thread of all the chapters. And I was like, oh, so yeah, it was really helpful. And I also had just a couple things for Raquel. I was wondering, have you read Southland by Nina Revor, Southland?
I haven't, but that sounds very interesting to check out for sure.
Yeah, it's a novel that's about the Watts riots, and it's about an interracial Japanese American and African American couple, and I'm kind of giving you a spoiler alert and saying there's a couple involved, but
that ties in really, really well, actually.
It's a murder mystery also, it's like a detective mystery, and it's historical fiction. It's about the Watts riot, and it's a really great book. So it's Nina Revor, Southland, and it's like really I kind of consider like high realism in the sense of it's like very specific to like the Crenshaw district. Like she does make up some names, but there's so many like real locations that she's referring to in the Crenshaw district of LA that it really it's really fascinating looking at that. And the other thing I was gonna recommend for you to look at is Seshu Foster. I'll type in the names there too. Has a poem that's called, or the first line is "We're Caffeinated by Rain," and he writes about gardeners in Los Angeles, and he has a line that says, we used to be Japanese, but we used to be Japanese, but with basically he infers like with internment and the displacement of Japanese, like now we're Mexicans. And so it's sort of like this like pan-ethnic narrating about their experiences. And I just thought about it because I think that could be an alternate reading of the last line of your poem. I think your reading is like totally valid as well. But as an alternate reading, it could be referring to just like the long history of Japanese labor as gardeners, especially in Los Angeles. It's really fascinating. And this is back to that connection with the Crenshaw district. Like, even if you go to Crenshaw district now, you see all these houses that have like the Japanese garden aesthetic in the front. And that is like that carryover from that era when it was a predominantly Japanese American community. And then there were like gardeners. So I thought that could also be like a contrast between the youth's sort of like desire for freedom, for liberation, but also in a way where there's also that reality of just like the labor, the unrecognized labor that the older generation put into, and like recognizing that. So I'm just gonna say that. Okay, let me type real quick my things. Anyone else have any other comments, thoughts?
It sounds like a great poem. I mean, I'd be interested in teaching it too. I'm teaching a comparative race and indigeneity class in the winter. Always looking for more Rex.
Yeah, let me add some, at least her main piece. Definitely, that's like the first main one that Amy Uyamatsu writes. And then the second poem that I explored comes from one of her first anthologies.
Yeah, I was surprised it was in the 90s, right? So there's a long gap between when she published that. Yeah, and that's kind of amazing that she taught at Venice for 25 years. I used to teach at a charter school in Venice. So not Venice High, but very close to Venice High. So I was like, oh, this would be interesting to see. I wonder if they ever celebrate her as like a local literary figure. That'd
Well,
be interesting.
she actually, well, the knowledge, what I could find as of recent, she used to pre-pandemic do lectures at in Little Tokyo whenever they'd have events and stuff there. But, you know, like, as it's very interesting studying somebody who's still alive, but not in the social media realm. So, you know, still stays off of the public, you know, spotlight, but has still, like, is such an impactful person, you know, being from somebody who's from LA, you know, someone who's also a teacher, just like learning about this just really amazing person. You know, they ask you that question, like, you could have coffee with somebody, you know, have a coffee date with someone. She would definitely be on my list.
That's awesome. Well, I want to respect everyone's time. So if people need to go, I want to let them go. But before I do I have any volunteers, anyone that was interested in organizing next year's PAMLA panel? It is going to be at UCLA. So for those of us that are LA based, or Southern California based, it's pretty accessible. Like I said, no pressure, Evan. Hyun from the first
can't do
panel.
it, sorry.
Okay, because Hyun from the first panel did mention that she might be interested, but it wasn't
Okay,
like
nice.
a hard commitment. So I can ask her some more. So I was just wondering, did anyone here want to?
I don't mind doing it if nobody else is, but it sounds like you already have somebody who's volunteered. So I'm not trying to. I don't want to bother taking anybody else's place.
Yeah, she didn't commit. She was just like, that sounds interesting. I'll think about it.
Oh, okay.
So I'll reach out. I'll kind of email both of you, see if maybe one of them will do it. And if you want, you can also co-chair to divide up some of the labor or to work on the CFP. Really, most of it is just remembering to put out the CFP. It's pretty much like the same CFP every year, but you can edit it a little bit based on the theme of the conference. But obviously, we kind of welcome any submissions related to Asian American literary and culture studies, and I think Asian American.
Well, part of it is that I just finished up chairing my poetry and poetics session, so I didn't want to. If somebody else wants to do it, I'm kind of off the hook. So but just in case if there isn't anybody else, that's
And I can do it again if like there isn't absolutely anyone else, because it's, again, UCLA is close by. So but next year is going to be in person, so for sure be in person.
Right.
Hopefully everyone, at least local, can still attend. You're not local, Toshiaki, but
right? I'm not local, but I'm based in West Coast, or rather, I need reason to come back to West Coast, so it's actually useful to have that excuse, but as I said, I've done chairing poetry and poetic sessions, and I've done that 2 years in a row. I don't want to monopolize chair roles. So if there are new people who want to do it, I don't have to.
Okay.
Just in case if nobody else does.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I don't know if you guys want to have any other comments. If not, you're welcome to go. It's late. Thank you guys for staying late.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you, Toshiaki and Raquel.
Thank you to everybody who
Nancy,
presented.
That's great.
And I think the recording will be available on Huva at some point. I'm not sure when, but when it is, I'll let you guys know, because I know there's people from first panel that wanted to watch but couldn't make this time. So hopefully it will be more available. And thank you, Laura, for being with us.
Thank you for staying.
Okay, have a good evening.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.